Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Kidney Talks with the GW Ron and Joy Paul Kidney Center, MOTEP, the National Minority Organ Tissue and Transplant Education Program, and the Pennsylvania Avenue Baptist Church. I am Jennifer Rigo with the GW Ron and Joy Paul Kidney Center, filling in for Reverend Kendra Curry. Today, our presentation will be on the role of the APOL1 gene for African Americans in transplantation, given by Dr. Joseph Keith Melanson. Dr. Melanson is the Chief of Transplant Institute and Division of Transplant Surgery at GW Hospital, Professor of Surgery at GW School of Medicine and Health Sciences, as well as the Medical Director for the GW Ron and Joy Paul Kidney Center. Dr. Melanson's specialties include kidney, liver, and pancreas transplantation, stem cell transplantation, and laparoscopic kidney donation. Among his research interests are minimizing immunosuppression, transplant organ tolerance, racial differences in outcomes of organ transplantation, and stem cell transplantation. Dr. Melanson is joined by one of our esteemed panelists, Dr. Clive Callender, who is a professor of surgery at Howard University's College of Medicine. In 1991, Dr. Callender conceptualized and founded National MOTEP for the purpose of increasing minority donation rates nationally. Without further delay, I would like to turn things over to Dr. Melanson to talk about the APOL1 gene for African Americans in transplantation. Dr. Melanson, take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer. And it's again my pleasure to be here. I think this is a very important subject because lots of people have asked about certain genetic linkages between kidney disease and certain ethnicities like African American. As we know, race doesn't exist. However, ethnicity does. And all of us, if you go back a few generations where our ancestors were clustered, we tend to have carried over those genes from, wherever in the world our ancestors come from. So for me, I would have had ancestors from Western Africa, and those African genes remain part of me. For you, Jennifer, you would have had genes from Italy or Sicily, and those genes are still in your body as of today. So today we're going to talk about some of the genetic linkages to kidney disease, or possibly linking us to kidney disease, and why that's important. First slide, please. All right, so the role of APOL1 gene for African Americans in transplantation. Now, I wouldn't expect the audience to understand this, but this is a very controversial aspect of kidney disease, or even kidney transplantation, because although this gene has been associated with kidney disease, we still have a lot of research to do to make sure that the way we think we understand the way this gene works in the transmission of kidney issues actually works that way. Next slide. So here is the issue, right? African Americans have a lot more kidney disease than everyone else in this country. About 3 to 4 times the rate of white individuals. Even if we correct for all of the issues that cause kidney problems like diabetes and high blood pressure and obesity, we still have this problem with our African American population. Kidney disease is much more of a problem in that population. And some subsets of kidney disease, such as HIV-associated nephropathy, are almost exclusively an African American disease. So the question, in research circles for years, there was a question of, is there something particular about African Americans that make them more susceptible to kidney disease? Next slide. Because African American patients inordinately suffer from kidney disease, we've looked for this genetic explanation. Apolipoprotein L1. All right, so this is a protein. It's a specific type of protein, and it's part of what we call the good cholesterol, HDL. When you go to your doctor, you get HDL, you should get an HDL number, and you get an LDL number. For your health, you want your HDL to be higher, you want your LDL to be lower, right? So a good HDL would be, well over 100, and a good LDL would be well under 100. So you want them to go in opposite directions. ApoL1 is part of that good cholesterol, part of the HDL. ApoL1 is found in various tissues around the body, but it's in the vascular endothelium, and we think it plays a role in the inflammatory response. This particular gene is found in this country almost exclusively in people of African or African American descent. This, because it's an inflammatory protein, the theory is that this may contribute to some kidney disease in African Americans. Next slide, please. Now, sleeping sickness, again, this is an African disease, African trypanosomiasis. That's a mouthful. This is the sleeping disease. And ApoL1 circulating in plasma has the ability to kill that bug that causes sleeping disease. So recently, 2 coding sequence variants have been shown to associate it with kidney disease, while at the same time conferring resistance against Trypanosoma brucei. Okay, so if you know about the history of sickle cell anemia, then this is a similar sort of story. And that's where I think the linkages were made. Because, in sickle cell anemia, or at least if you are a carrier of the sickle cell gene, so you don't have both of the genes, but you just have one of the genes, then it confers resistance to the bug that causes malaria, right? So I think in much the same way, many researchers were thinking, well, this is a similar sort of thing where we have a gene, ApoL1, that's seen almost exclusively in African Americans, just like the gene for sickle cell is seen almost exclusively in African Americans. We know sickle cell confers a benefit to the African or African American population insofar as malaria, which is the #1 killer of people in the world. People don't think about that because in America we don't have malaria, but malaria kills more people than anything else in the world. We have this global pandemic with COVID, but COVID hasn't even begun to touch the tip of the iceberg with what malaria does, has done in the history of the world, and even what malaria does within a normal year. Malaria kills millions and millions of people. So having a resistance to malaria is a huge advantage. And I think that for the researchers, this connection has been a very strong connection because they made this logical leap to say, well, if sickle cell carriers have all this resistance and we see the same thing with resistance to sleeping sickness, well, then maybe just like sickle cell disease is, not good to have, kidney disease, which is not good to have, is just a byproduct of this. Now, my issue with this is they may have gotten ahead of themselves a little bit in that explanation. But here you go. People who have at least one copy of ApoL1 variants are resistant to these infections, but people that have 2 copies, at least the theory is that they have an increased risk of kidney disease. And I keep saying theories because, in science, the gold standard is what we call prospective research, right? Randomized trials. And it's hard to do those sorts of things with genetic testing. And what has been published are not that gold standard level of scientific inquiry. What's been published is a lot of observational studies. So what the scientists have done is they've gone in and seen that there are increased incidences of kidney disease in certain populations and then tested them for these genes and they see a linkage. But again, that's not gold standard research, but it is interesting. Next slide. So all current scholarship linking ApoL1 to kidney disease has been based upon small molecular studies and on retrospective patient data. Now, if you know anything about the NIH, just like anything, just like whatever's trending on Twitter, the NIH tends to get caught up in what is novel and what is sexy, and genetic research is very sexy. So, and when you are a scientist looking for NIH dollars, you want to be caught up in something that the NIH wants to fund. So a lot of funds have gone towards studying of these genes. However, large-scale prospective gold standard research is required and is currently just underway, but those studies are not as of yet completed. The results of these large studies will be able to definitively answer if ApoL1 expression is linked in any way to the development of kidney disease. Next slide. All right, so this is, I love making this point because it is what I believe much more important: genetic versus epigenetic. And we get confused about this a lot in the general public. Genetics means gene-based. Humans have 23 chromosomes. They house all of our genetic information, and all modern humans have very similar genetic variations. Let me say that again. Humans have 23 chromosomes, and all of us are very similar. I've heard Dr. Callender make this point over and over and over again, and I'll make it here. What does this mean? It means there's no such thing as race. There's no such thing as race because genetically, you just don't have variations between Homo sapiens. Okay? So by genetic combinations or genetic variations, we are just not that dissimilar. Small genetic variations called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, confer genetic variations of certain genetic types. These are the sorts of things that you can see in ethnic groups, right? Because these are tiny little variations and they can be carried on. That's why, in medicine, we talk about little groups that carry these SNPs, like Ashkenazi Jewish ascent, having progenitors that are of Ashkenazi backgrounds. You can have these little SNPs that are carried over. We see this in all sorts of variants of ethnic groups, but this does not connote racial differences. I'm sorry, okay. And then epigenetics refers to all of the proteins and RNA that are apart from the genetic code. In other words, what epigenetics, epi means around, it talks about the things that touch DNA, right? So genetics is the actual DNA. Epigenetics are the RNA or the proteins that touch the DNA. Why is that important? Because, Jennifer and I could have the same genetic background, but certain genes for her could be turned on, like blue eyes. And for me, I could have that same blue eye gene, but it's turned off. So I'll have brown eyes. The gene could be there, but it's the epigenetics, it's the proteins that touch the gene that turn on or off certain expressions. That's why even within families, you can see all of these variations and people wonder, why does this child have green eyes and this child has hazel eyes and this child? That's because those genes that can be very similar, they can have different expressions based on epigenetics, right? And that's why you could know, I grew up with some friends that were identical twins, but they were very different. They looked similar, but they were very different in so many ways. That's because of the epigenetic phenomena. This is more important in medicine, these epigenetic phenomena. And this is more important in human variations, not genetic, but epigenetic. Next slide. Okay, so I wanted to leave lots of time for questions because I'm sure like I said, this is a controversial area. We are seeing some linkages with these genes with kidney disease. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so the way huge studies are done, what typically happens is a lot of money is made available so that certain things could be studied. And we look at whatever those issues are. Like one of the things that linked ApoL1 to kidney disease came from these huge cardiology studies where scientists were looking at certain therapies and how they affected cardiac outcomes. In other words, if you're on certain blood pressure medicines or certain blood thinners, were you less likely to have a heart attack? Were you less likely to die early because of cardiac disease? But whenever you do a huge study like that, where you have hundreds of thousands of patients, that's a very rich research environment. So any data you get from those types of patients, you want to be able to study in maybe like what's called a sub-analysis. So in these huge studies, what they did in the sub-analysis is they looked at certain groups to determine if other things were going on. And what they found in these large studies was that African American patients had more kidney disease. That wasn't, new ground. We know African Americans have more kidney disease, but they wanted to figure out, well, was there something that we saw in the study that could give us a clue as to why African Americans have kidney disease? And so people that had funds for genetic research took the blood that was taken in those studies and looked for genetic differences. And in those studies, they found that there was a link between having these genes, the ApoL1 genes, and an association with kidney disease. And it was other studies like this that linked together the idea that ApoL1 could be associated with kidney disease. The reason why that's not a gold standard, like what I was telling you earlier, prospective randomized studies, is because that wasn't the original research question. In order for you to have the most power, is what we call it in research circles, what you need to do is have a premise and then test that particular premise with a large group of patients and determine if that premise is correct. Not just a correlation, but an actual cause and effect. And that's what we haven't had, but we will have. But anyway, I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Melanson. Dr. Callender, do you have anything you want to add on this subject matter?
Yes, this is an area of great interest to me because there's so many ramifications. And the first thing that comes to mind, I remember about 20 years ago, somebody from the audience made a comment that reflects what you said about epigenetics. And that is that what is the impact of the social determinants of health on the gene? And at the time, we were pretty ignorant and didn't realize that, of course, you hit the nucleus of the question, because we now know that the external forces impact the gene. And that's what Dr. Melanson was talking about when he was talking about epigenetics. So that these social determinants of health, how do they impact the gene? And how does that conform to what you mentioned as epigenetics, Dr. Melanson?
Yeah, great question, Dr. Callender. And of course, as usual, you cut right to the quick. And I totally 100% agree with your premise, which is there in the question, which is social determinants have a ton to do with epigenetics, right? I love to give this example of my cousin, Donald. And I asked Donald if he minds me using him in all of my talks, and he does. But I'm from South Louisiana, and my cousin came from a big family. There were 9 brothers and sisters. And, if Creole families from South Louisiana, we eat good food. And good food down there means food with a lot of seasoning, but also, unfortunately, a lot of salt, a lot of fat. All right. So Donald comes from a typical family, but as a child, only about 10 years of age, he was diagnosed with high blood pressure. So his doctor tells his mom, hey, this kid's going to have problems in his life because he already has high blood pressure and he's not even a teenager. So you need to feed him a different diet than you would typically eat in South Louisiana. So from the time Donald was a child, he was given a different diet than his siblings. His siblings had the typical South Louisiana diet. Donald always maybe didn't have meat, definitely did not have added salt. So his mom would have to cook a different dish because there's no such thing as not eating meat and salt and fat in my family. So Donald would always she'd make a different plate for him. Well, over the years of not eating the same kinds of food, his taste buds were different, and he became a vegetarian and even vegan. He's a vegan today. Well, what has that meant for him? It's meant that his genes, the same as all of his brothers and sisters, but his epigenetics changed. As his epigenetics changed, his health changed, particularly in contradistinction to his brothers and sisters. All of his brothers and sisters, not to insult my cousins, but they look like typical South Louisiana people, right? They could lose a few pounds and their cholesterol is a little bit on the high side. They might have a little bit of high blood pressure and so on and so forth. Whereas Donald, who's now in his 60s, is very, very thin, very muscular. Now he runs marathons. He's a vegan. He lives in the Northeast now, so he's a Yankee. But the point is, he changed his diet. He changed his behavior in comparison to his brothers and sisters. Although they all have the same genes, they have different behaviors, and therefore it manifests in their health. What Dr. Callender is talking about is social determinants. What type of food do you have access to? What type of food do you eat? Do you eat food that has a lot of preservatives? How well do you rest? How much water do you drink? How much do you pray or meditate? All those things that Dr. Callender and has been espousing for years, we now know he was way ahead of his time. Because if you listen to what is going on in these pogwams, in Eastern medicine and the herbalists and all that stuff that they're doing in California and in Manhattan, it's what Dr. Calendar's been talking about for years. It's social determinants of health. If you take people that don't have good access to all these things and you give them better access, you train them to eat differently and act differently and decrease the stress and increase the sleep and increase the water, all of a sudden they're healthier. So yes, Dr. Callender, all that stuff vastly affects, very effectively changes your epigenetics. Genes don't change, but epigenetics do change.
Jennifer, if you don't have any other questions, I had some other questions, so it's up to you.
Sure. I have one comment from an audience member that would love for us to do a talk on, I hope I'm not butchering this word, Dr. Melanson, thalassemia in African or in descent. So maybe that's a topic for future reference. But there is one question. Dr. Melanson, I have a question for you.
Sure.
You talk about culture also, right? And how much it affects just not only our health, but our diet and our lifestyle. And so it sounds to me like your cousin wound up kind of going against the culture of incredible Creole Southern New Orleans food, which is bar none one of the best, I think. But anyway, I say that because so if you are predisposed, right, as we have learned that African Americans and Hispanics can be to kidney disease, is it safe to say that if you really and truly do change your diet, which is in essence almost changing the culture that you've grown up with, right, that you were raised on, that you can kind of reverse, the how you are exposed perhaps or predisposed to the disease?
Right, and I think that's where a little bit of the misnomer of this stuff being genetic rather than epigenetic comes from. Because here, what we have found in numerous studies is that these same proteins and RNA and whatnot, these things are heritable. In other words, not just your genes are passed on to your progeny, but these enzymes also, these isotypes of enzymes also get passed to the progeny. So, Donald, not only because of what he did with his diet and exercise, changed his epigenetics because of what everyone else was eating and the way they were behaving, but they were, since this is, like you said, cultural, these epigenetic phenomena were being passed down from generation to generation. So what you're doing is you're not only changing your environment based on what's going on in real time, you're making those isotypes change that may have been passed down from one or two generations prior to you. And I'm sure people have lots of stories of things that were in their family, and they think, well, everybody in my family's been big and I'm big because it's in our genes. No, 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 no. That's not true. It's not in your genes usually, but it could be in your epigenetic phenomena. In other words, everyone likes to eat a lot of dessert. And so the enzymes that are revved up to eat to want sweets, you have them. Your mother had it, your grandmother had it, but you can change it. Now all of a sudden you decide, I love broccoli, and you start eating broccoli like a madman. All right, and then now you change up those enzymes a little bit. You love broccoli, and then in your progeny, instead of producing a ice cream loving person, you produce a broccoli loving person, right? So these things can be inherited, although they're not genetic, and they can be changed. And a lot of that has to do with culture. I know, like, again, going back to my South Louisiana upbringing, I still, and so does the rest of my family, we love South Louisiana food. But what we've done, or what I've tried to do in cooking it, is to change up the traditional ingredients. Instead of so much butter and fat and salt, we try to create the same sort of taste profile, but with olive oil instead of butter, trying to use lean meats instead of pork, and spices but not salt, and that way you can change things up a little bit. For a matter of fact, the irony of a lot of the foods that we call like soul food and southern food, these things that have a heavy West African influence, if you go to the original West African dishes, the original dishes that the taste profile came from was much healthier than what the slaves had to recreate with what they had, right? People in West Africa weren't eating pork, right? That wasn't a big part of West African diet. Goat was a big part of their diet, but there weren't a lot of goats in Alabama and Mississippi, so they had to, so a Mississippi goat is a pig. So they had to deal with what they had. So it's just like it's funny because if you look at the music, it's the same way. This African or Afro-Caribbean music changed. I watched something the other day talking about salsa music. Well, salsa music actually comes from Afro-Caribbean music that came from Cuba, that came from West Africa, and we did the same thing with diets. But my point in talking about health is that going healthier is actually going back to our roots.
Jennifer, I did have a question. I know that Keith has a thing about the studies, but I must point out that it is clear that people have suggested that if you have one of these genes, you may have one impact. If you have two, you have another impact. And if you have two of these genes, they're suggesting that your success after transplantation is going to be worse. They're also suggesting that you're more likely to have kidney disease. What are your thoughts relative to some of these studies that have been suboptimal, but studies nonetheless that demonstrate that there has been a negative impact on kidney disease and transplantation in people who have one or two of these APOL1 genes?
Yeah, no, good question, Dr. Calendar, and I think you're even in the updated information. I think we have learned more about ApoL1. And one of the things that now, most of the studies or most of the people that have done research in this area don't believe just one copy confers risk. And that's good, because at one time, and I think you are aware of this, we were actually, not we and our program, but in some programs, if you had one copy of APOL1, they were not allowing you to donate your kidney to your loved one, which I think was really unjust. But now there is still a thought that having both copies of the APOL1 variant might confer some risk. But even if you have two copies, what they're thinking is that it's a two-hit phenomenon. It's not just that you have the two copies, but something else like protein in your urine or high blood pressure or whatever. So yes, I think that like I said, the jury's still out, because better studies are coming. But my pushback has always been, and you are at the forefront of this, which is there's a lot of stuff that we already know causes kidney disease. Where is all the NIH money to treat that? Right? We know high blood pressure causes kidney disease, right? We should have studies going where, we try to get rid of high blood pressure in the Black community. We know diabetes causes kidney disease, yet right now, one of the hardest medicines to get a hold of is insulin, right? We should make sure that we are doing a great job with high blood pressure treatment. We are doing a great job with diabetes treatment. We're doing a great job as physicians in the medical establishment with engaging with our patients about their weight, right? Again, I know, Dr. Callan, you've talked about this for a long time, but these are things that in medicine we kind of avoided, and I think that what needs to happen is that the stuff that we know causes diseases needs to be better addressed. That's one of my pushbacks. All this sexy genetic stuff, yeah, let's keep doing it, but we know the stuff that we know we should be trying to treat.
That was fascinating, Dr. Calendar. I did not even wasn't aware of that. So thank you for bringing that point up. We do have two comments. One, I have to laugh because I've heard this phrase so many times. Regina Miller Mack says, so the phrase "it runs in the family" sometimes gives people the thought that there's like nothing they can do, perhaps about their health. But clearly you've pointed out that that's not necessarily the case. Right. Angela Brown asks, is it helpful to substitute sea salt or Himalayan salt in our diets?
Yeah, I've had that, and I bought them. I have them both in my counter. So yes, I bought into that as well. Although the real answer is salt is salt. So what you want to do is avoid salt. Now, I think it's okay to use a little bit, and if those types of salt gives you more taste, then fine. If you get a little bit more taste from and using yet less salt, then yeah, maybe that's better. But I think, and I can tell you from my own personal experience, and I cook Creole foods all the time, and I can tell, and my sons are the biggest critics in the world. So if they eat it, then it means that they're liking it. And what I've been doing is adding these new spices, well, new to me, new spices that I did not learn traditionally in cooking South Louisiana food. So like cardamom and paprika and things of that nature. So you could go into your neighborhood store, particularly if you live in a really nice upscale neighborhood like Dr. Calendar. So when you go to Whole Foods, you can go and you can see all that spice rack, and you can just go crazy with it. I mean, and that anything other than salt is fine. It's actually going to decrease inflammation and may help your blood pressure, not just by avoiding salt, but anything that's anti-inflammatory will have an effect of maybe decreasing your blood pressure. So yes, the Himalayan salt and all these other salt variants, I think is okay in limitation. Like people ask about garlic salt. Yeah, but the bigger issue is just decreasing salt and add something else. Like where I'm from, we love cayenne pepper, right? Pepper is good. Any type of pepper is good. I mean, it might burn a little bit, but it makes the food so much more savory, and that's what you want. The more savory, and the studies have been done on this. The more savory the food, the less you need to eat to feel full, right? If you're eating something very bland, then then you feel like you need to eat more of it to feel full. So adding uh, different taste profiles or different spices will actually make your palate work a little bit more, but you will enjoy the meal. And that's why at these upscale restaurants that like Jennifer goes to, these restaurants can give you smaller portions, and you feel fuller. And it's because of the spices, and that's how they can charge you all that at the end of the meal.
Dr. Melanson, we have a question from our audience members. What are your thoughts on sugar avoidance as it relates to kidney disease?
Yeah, so similarly to salt, if we should avoid sugar, I mean salt, we should avoid sugar. Sugar's the twin evil, and it's also something. Both of them are great preservatives, right? So that's why you have such high concentrations of sugar and salt in preserved food, right? Because it kills bacteria. It kills the bugs that would spoil the food. But guess what? It kills us too. So if you're taking too much of these preservatives, it's bad. And that's why cooking at home is so much better than buying stuff all over the counter from a convenience store, because all those preservatives is part of the problem, particularly for our people. The more, and that, when you start talking about things like food deserts, what food deserts means is that you have to go in and you have to buy this fast preserved food, and that's not good for you. When you cook at home, when you cook fresh stuff at home, fresh vegetables and whatnot, then you're avoiding all of that stuff. The other thing that people sometimes ask me about is juicing and juices and all that. You know what? You know what the best type of way to get good fruit juice? Eat the fruit, right? And then you're getting it the way God made it, right? So an orange is so much healthier than orange juice. An apple is so much healthier than apple juice, because you're getting all the fiber. God created it that way for a reason. That's the way you should get the fruit and the juice. And same thing with vegetables. Just eat vegetables. I saw something on a commercial the other day, and it was like these fruit and vegetable vitamins. And it was like, oh, fruits and vegetables are so good for you. Let's take these vitamins. No, don't take those vitamins. Go eat some fruit and vegetables.
Dr. Melanson, we have a question. Is it safe to take vitamin D supplements if you have kidney disease and have low vitamin D levels? The person takes a multivitamin, but didn't know if they should also take some vitamin D as well.
Yeah, vitamin D is a good one, and 'cause we are finding that a lot more patients than we knew have vitamin D deficiencies, and it's a particular issue for people of color like me, because our darker skin means that we don't absorb as much vitamin D from the sun. The reason we have darker skin is because the areas where our ancestors come from, there was so much sunlight that we had to protect ourselves from too much sunlight. But it does mean if you don't get out a lot, if you stay indoors a lot, if you're not outdoors, that you might have low vitamin D levels. So yes, taking a supplement is not bad. But you know what? Again, the better way to get getting vitamin D? Go outdoors. So go walking outdoors, play tennis, or play golf, but just go walking. Dr. Callender never learned how to drive, so like one of the benefits of that is being able to go walking a lot, right? So he has been walking all these years, and that's why he's in such great shape. But yeah, the best way to get vitamin D, be outdoors. Let the sun give you vitamin D. But to answer the question, yes, taking a vitamin D supplement is not a bad idea.
Jennifer, I had another question that I think is appealing to Dr. Ronson, and that is we talk about genes and altering genes, and we think that doing that may be a good thing. But what is the downstream effect of changing the genes? When you talk about the fact that APO gene kills off sleeping sickness, when we modify that and change that, what else are we changing? Or are there downstream effects of gene alterations that we should be careful about?
Absolutely, Dr. Calendar, and you allude to a great point. One of the reasons, it's how I started to talk, saying that there's no such thing as racist because genetically we are all so similar. Well, there's a reason why genetically we're so similar. In other words, from an evolutionary point of view, we don't change our genes that often. It takes a lot of pressure for our genes to change even a tiny little bit. Why is that? That's because we know that altering the genes can have a lot of bad, deleterious downstream effects. So the way God made us, He made our genes very, very hard to get to. And even when the DNA unfurls in order to be copied, there's not that many things that touch the DNA. And all of the changes, which we call the epigenetics, is the stuff that touches the DNA. But the DNA itself is not altered. And the reason it's not altered is because just one little base change in your DNA can have a lot of downstream negative effects. So Dr. Calendar's right. You don't want to mess with your genetic code because you have no idea what comes from that. So, like, let's say you could take kidneys from donors and then go in and change the genetic code and then do the transplant. Well, that doesn't sound like a smart thing to do because that's exactly what cancer is, right? I'm not saying that cancer, you would create a cancer, but what I'm saying is these little alterations in DNA is exactly what happens in cancerous cells, though, because you turn on or off these signals that tell the cells that divide when they should divide and when they shouldn't divide. And cancer is just unregulated division of cells. So we have to be very careful when we come up with any therapies that would alter our DNA because that's headed down a primrose path with a lot of possibly bad things that could occur.
Dr. Melanson, we've talked about diet a lot as it relates to just good health. And so there's a question in the audience asking about, is there a kidney diet for stage 3 chronic kidney disease?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. And of course, there are very specific diets for people with renal disease. The good news about stage 3, however, is that your kidney function is still reasonably preserved so that you don't have to make huge alterations in your diet. It's not until you are really more in late stage 4 or 5 that you really need to avoid things like potassium. That's a big one. But you got to worry about your potassium levels. You got to worry about phosphorus once you have what we call end stage kidney disease. But at stage 3, there are things that you should be doing though that can preserve your kidney function. One of the main ones is decreasing the amount of animal protein. So you can still get a lot of protein in your diet, but animal protein you should start to try to decrease. You should go to leaner forms of protein. So more fish, and by fish I don't mean fried fish. I mean like baked fish, and then like lean meats like turkey or maybe chicken breast instead of meatier. I'm sorry, like red meat and red meat with a lot of fat, like a ribeye and stuff. These things put more pressure on your kidney because the kidney needs to work harder to expel all of that protein. So that's one thing you should be doing when you are in stage 3. And the other thing is Although you can still drink a lot of water, you should be pushing away from sodas because again, that sodas have a lot of phosphorus, and unless they're diet sodas, you're gonna have a lot of sugar. So what but the most important thing to do when you're in stage three is to try to address what put you in kidney disease in the first instance. So if you're stage three and you have kidney disease because of high blood pressure, the most important thing to do is to be mindful of your blood pressure. So that means taking medicine possibly, but salt. Salt is the main thing because most African Americans, they have salt sensitive high blood pressure. So decreasing the salt in your diet to decrease the blood pressure is going to put less pressure on your kidney. If diabetes is your issue, then changing your diet about trying to decrease complex carbohydrates, decrease sugar, increasing your activities. Because most type 2 diabetics are diabetics because they're not active enough. They not only eat too much sugar, but they're not active enough. These are the sort of things that people with stage 3 disease need to be doing.
So, Dr. Melanson, we're going to go to the other end of the spectrum for a moment because the next question that is asked is, do you have any suggestions for a kidney donor regarding diet and health?
So after donation,
So the woman says kidney donor. I don't know if she can clarify, but perhaps
sure.
she's going to donate a kidney or she's already donated a kidney.
Yeah, yeah. So for a person who would be before they donate a kidney donor, those patients are going to be very, very healthy. So no program in the country is going to even consider a person to be a kidney donor unless their kidney function is just optimal, perfect in every way. And those patients tend to be very healthy. Although we do older people than we used to do as kidney donors. At one time, a person couldn't donate over the age of 50. Now I've done people that have donated into their 80s, but they have great kidney health. They have great overall health. After donation, it you start to worry about things like what's called hyperfiltration. And so we know that hyperfiltration can happen a little bit after you give someone one kidney. We have two kidneys and one and then a spare, right? That's why you can give away one. However, when that kidney that's left, in order to make up for the kidney that you lost, the blood will go through that kidney a little bit faster, which is okay. That's normal. But what you don't want is it to go faster still. And that will occur in people that are pushing the kidney. And by pushing the kidney, I mean high protein diets, right? So again, we don't mind people eating even red meat after they donate their kidney, but you don't want a high protein diet. I've had people that are muscle builders. They like to work out a lot. They like to take a lot of protein supplements. People like that, you counsel them against taking so much protein after donation because that can have ill effects on the kidney that's left and make it hyperfiltrate. The other thing is just weight, right? You wouldn't want a person that donates a kidney to gain a lot of weight because that's going to cause their kidney to have to hyperfiltrate. And then the other thing that can happen as the flow through the kidney increases, you can have alterations in the hormones that come from the kidney, and it can drive up your blood pressure a little bit. So as far as a diet modification, you wouldn't want a person that's donated their kidney to eat too much salt for the same reason that we talked about earlier. So because we want them to definitely avoid high blood pressure. One of the main things we look for after people donate their kidneys to see if their blood pressure goes up. And if it does, we want to bring it right back down because, again, that high blood pressure can damage the kidney that's left after they donate.
Thank you, Dr. Melanson. And the woman that asked that question did clarify that she already donated a kidney.
Yeah.
Yeah, you addressed that. Dr. Calendar, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Yes, uh, you know, we have been doing a lot of screening for protein. We're also doing tests for blood pressure, BMI. But the one thing that we don't talk too much about is the role gene testing plays in terms of making the diagnosis of kidney disease. So if you find somebody who has protein in the urine, is it then appropriate to get genetic testing to find out what's causing the proteinuria?
That's a very good point, Dr. Callender, and the answer is yes, absolutely. Because and you know, I beat this drum all the time, talking about the top 3 reasons why people have kidney disease, but that doesn't mean that's the only reason you have kidney disease. So there are genetic reasons, real genetic reasons to have kidney disease. And the most common one in the African American community would be FSGS. And it is of the utmost importance that you get properly diagnosed with FSGS because it can come back even after transplant. And there is a huge difference between FSGS that when it comes back after transplant and when it's diagnosed. In other words, if the team knows you have FSGS and you get a transplant, then they are very much on the lookout to see if the FSGS comes back in the new kidney. If it's treated early, it can be very effectively treated. And FSGS is one of those diseases, if it recurs and the doctors don't pick it up right away, it can really knock out the new transplant. So what Dr. Callender is saying is very important. And that's just one of the diseases that can be picked up by genetic testing. IgA nephropathy, thin basement membrane disease, as well as others, polycystic kidney disease. All these things can be picked up with genetic testing. And we are utilizing genetic testing a lot more in these patients because of what Dr. Callender said.
Thanks, Dr. Melanson. And the last question that we're going to take today is, should we move towards a Mediterranean diet?
Absolutely. I think that the Mediterranean diet is a great diet in so many ways because once again, you know, you have these fad diets where you get rid of fat and you get rid of carbohydrates and you get rid of this and you get rid of that. And the Mediterranean diet, I think, is something that it's not so much a diet as it is a lifestyle. So, you know, you want people to do things that they can maintain, right? You don't want to do a fad anything because by fad, you mean short-lived. What you want is people to have a healthy lifestyle. You know, Dr. Calendar's been talking about this for years, you know, having a healthier lifestyle, that meditation and water and sleep, that's all part of a healthier lifestyle. The Mediterranean diet, which is a mixture of complex carbohydrates and certain good fats like avocado and olive oil and olives, you know, those are good fats, but, you know, and good carbohydrates like starches and fruit. So yes, I think the more we move to that sort of diet, the healthier we are. And I totally and wholeheartedly support that. The more nuts, you know, cheeses, you know, but in moderation, just like they do in Europe. But again, also incorporating movement. So whatever the diet is, in incorporating movement. You know, one of my favorite places to go is you know, in the Mediterranean is Italy. Well, why is everybody thin in Italy? Well, because they move, they walk around a lot, they ride their bikes incessantly, and they take their time when they eat. You know, in America, we wolf down our food, right? And so that's not a healthier way to eat. So it's not just the Mediterranean diet, it's the Mediterranean lifestyle, right? They take siestas, they take naps in the middle of the day. Right, that's very, very. That takes a lot of stress away when you can take a 2-hour, 3-hour nap in the middle of the day. So the Mediterranean lifestyle is even more important than the Mediterranean diet.
Well said, Dr. Melanson. In wrapping up, Dr. Callender, do you have any final thoughts or comments that you wanted to add?
Just that this has been a show that talks about genes, and it's a topic that is not discussed often. And I think it's great that you're taking the time to talk about this.
Agreed. Dr. Melanson, do you have any final thoughts or comments that you wanted to make before we wrap up our presentation today?
No, I think it's been great. The one other thing I would add, and I've started doing this personally, and I know it works, is drinking more water, particularly at dinner time. So, now when I go to a restaurant, first thing I do is I will drink 2 glasses of water. And it decreases how much you eat. It helps your digestion, and it even helps you sleep better when you finally get home that night. So more water. And I heard Dr. Calendar say this years ago, but it is definitely a smart thing to do.
That's great advice. When I joined Weight Watchers years ago, they said that. They said the more water you drink at dinner, the less you are going to fill up, which is also why they used to recommend having soup right before you have a meal, because the liquid fills you up. This has been a tremendous presentation and conversation, Dr. Melanson and Dr. Calendar. I want to thank all the audience members that participated and asked these very thought-provoking questions and took the time out to attend our presentation with Kidney Talks. We will be back in 2 weeks. That is Friday, May 27th at 2 p.m. And we hope that you are able to join us. Thank you so much, everybody. Stay healthy, stay safe, be blessed, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Thanks again. Take care.